I was very pleased to be invited by the editors to write a case study on researching periodical networks for this second volume of their Routledge handbook. As I argue in my chapter, in order to understand the impact of the periodical press on a writer's life in the 19th century, we need to understand the complex networks that enabled and sustained it. Periodical networks, as soon becomes clear, are inextricably bound up with other networks, both literary and ideological. I decided to focus on William and Mary Howitt because they were ubiquitous figures in literary and political circles in the 1840s and 50s. Their periodical writings, mostly published anonymously, appeared in cheap weeklies like Chambers, their own Howitt's Journal, Douglas Jerrold's Shilling Magazine, Household Words, as well as the Monthly Repository, the Athenaeum, and Good Words, but less often in the periodicals indexed by the Wellesley Index, making identification more difficult. Mary's poetry was published in annuals and extensively pirated in American periodicals. The poems she published in higher quality journals were not listed, of course, by Wellesley. The attraction of writing this chapter was to test what I had learned, working often intuitively from traditional empirical sources, contemporary autobiographies, biographies, letters, and modern scholarly sources, to test that against what was revealed by searches on electronic databases, notably ProQuest's British periodicals and Cengage's 19th century UK periodicals. As you might expect, these digital resources threw up a wealth of raw data, associating the Howitts with many new titles and suggesting that their active engagement with periodicals persisted into the 1860s and 70s, and in Mary's case into the 1880s, whereas I had thought that they were at their most productive in the 40s and 50s, and that while their public profile increased, their periodical output tailed off in later decades. Some of these supposedly new outputs may be replications. Some will prove to be erroneous, others will be brief notes rather than stories, articles, and poems. So what I've learned from working on this project is that periodicals research must combine these two methodologies, the traditional and the digital, and must use one to test and refine the others. The Howitts networks were determined by geography, by their politics, and by their religion. They found it difficult to sustain a literary life from Nottingham, and their fortunes changed dramatically when they moved south, eventually to Clapton in East London. At the same time, they drifted away from the Society of Friends and towards the Unitarians, joining a congregation at South Place Chapel in Finsbury, which brought them into contact with W.J. Fox, editor of the Monthly Repository, and a group of reformers and politically engaged writers that included Douglas Jerrold and Harriet Martineau. One of their neighbours in Clapton was John Chapman, whose parties in the 1840s later transferred to 142 Strand, where the Howitts met the eclectic group who contributed to the Westminster Review. Through their artist daughter Anna Mary, they knew the first generation of feminists and also the pre-Raphaelites. What emerges from a close examination of contemporary and modern sources is a pattern of interlocking networks, mainly, but not exclusively, based in London, which the Howitts infiltrated in the 1830s and 40s, becoming in turn nodes of new networks of writers, particularly of women writers, and also of artists in the 1850s. Using modern technology, these interlocking networks can be illustrated graphically to demonstrate the intricate connections that underpin the 19th century periodical press as a whole, an aspect that is crucial to our understanding of it. So in working on my chapter for this book, I have become even more persuaded that periodicals research must embrace both traditional methodologies and digital ones.
I wanted to be videoed in my garden rather than in front of my bookshelves, partly as a tribute to our wonderful 3 editors who deserve all the bouquets that we can give them. and who achieved a unique double with winning the Colby 2 years running. But it's also a nod towards the introduction to the first of their 2 volumes, which opens with a quotation from an 1829 article in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, likening periodicals to flowers. In this playful passage, to quote the editors, periodicals are likened to flowers not only because they give pleasure, but because they give us a sense of the flow of time. Gardens are like periodicals. They're all about time and seasons. Michael Wolff likened the field of Victorian periodicals to a golden stream flowing like time. Thanks to the scholarly work of 50 years since and the development of new technologies, I think the field of periodical studies may be characterised now as a sea rather than a stream. However, the complex relationship of periodicals to time remains central to all our work, whatever watery metaphors we use. The Blackwood's passage, the editors tell me, has been much copied and reprinted in that process of remediation with which we're all familiar. And it's so much easier to trace these now with digital resources. In the Routledge volume, I called my chapter The Body in the Archive, partly with a nod to the role of researcher as detective, but also because of an awareness of the importance of the corpus, the body, the archives with which we work, and the issues facing us now as researchers with the nature of our archives. Digitisation has opened up vast resources and we can't do without them. And we're all aware that scanning a digital copy is not the same as looking at a yellowing page of an 1858 magazine. However, as Jim Mussell, Paul Fife and others remind us in that excellent volume for Victorian Periodical Review from 2016, edited by Shannon Smith and Anne Hale, we need to bring more awareness to the processes by which these resources reach us. Scholarly fashion, research funding, accident, but above all by the workings of global capitalism, which shape the digital archive. I think there's a danger, perhaps particularly for my generation, of thinking that the kind of archive which I describe in my chapter, namely the archive of the Cooperative Society, with its minute books, its bound volumes, its lists of library holdings, somehow give us a better, less tainted access to the past. But these papers too are mediated by past choices, librarians, by practices of binding without covers or advertisements and so on. And the decision of the cooperative archivist not to allow any of its materials to be digitised if they would be behind a paywall is at one level an admirable principled commitment to free access. It also means that unless you have very good research funding or live nearby, as I do, you won't ever see the archive. We can't really escape the way capitalism makes our archives. And if paywalls are the 21st century equivalent of taxes on knowledge, imposed not by overweening governments but by overweening corporations, none of us escape the way they shape our archives. The other area I want to mention is the project of my chapter, namely the way in which periodicals, and particularly their correspondence columns, may or may not enable us to research readers and their relationships to the periodicals and to the other readers enabled through its pages. What Benedict Anderson, in a much critiqued phrase, described as imagined communities. The Women's Corner in the Cooperative News, which I studied, ran a correspondence column which not only enabled women to write into the anonymous space of the periodical, but also to contact each other, and out of that grew historical exchanges, face-to-face exchanges. I recognise their interchange of letters in the weekly news as of that historical moment, the late 19th, early 20th century. But as I read, I can't help thinking of contemporary media, of Facebook groups and the Me Too campaign. The Blackwood's article imagined periodical time as flow, and archives bring with them sedimented layers of deposits laid down by waves of historical research. We struggle with how to honour the past in its own terms while recognising our present moment in time. However, one thing which I'd like to say in conclusion is quantum physics tells us that time and space are not as they seem. Time does not flow, it curves. Space is not separate from time. The particles which make up all matter, physics tells us, can be in two places at the same time. We know this. Perhaps physicists are catching up with periodical scholars.
Hello everyone, greetings from London. As we've just won the World Cup of Periodical Studies, as you can see from these commemorative stickers, I hope you'll excuse my initial focus of this lecture being on football. I'm going to begin my section of this presentation with something I saw this year in a contemporary and non-scholarly periodical which I had the print subscription to. When Saturday Comes is a football magazine which began life in the 1980s as a fanzine, a non-professional magazine distributed informally at matches and via post, but which by the 1990s and to the present day had become a more standard magazine, albeit one with an intellectual approach with a satirical leaning, as can be seen in its cover captions, which are inspired by the UK satirical magazine Private Eye. When Saturday Comes is seemingly thriving now, with a children's spin-off which is less political recently produced, along with a full archive of online back issues. I was genuinely shocked when reading a recent piece in When Saturday Comes. The April 2018 issue included an article by Ian Prenderleith entitled Browsing History. It was an account of what he called the golden age of independent online football writing. In the middle of the 2000s, he had a column which covered this. In the article, Prenderleith notes that many once popular amateur football websites and blogs have not been updated for several years, with some bought up by media giants like ESPN and subsequently cancelled, and others now carrying the ever ominous promise to be returning shortly. Back in the day, I was an enthusiastic reader of many of these sites, primarily because I felt they, along with online forums, afforded a voice to football fans who had previously been silent or voiced only in amateur writing in fanzines or in the tiny letters pages of Sunday newspaper sports sections. I wanted to see what real fans, free of much editorial interference, were thinking. There's a relatively recent move in 19th-century periodical studies towards this too, in recent pieces on correspondence columns, for instance, and my own recent research on the working man's friend and family instructor, which claimed to contain within its pages contributions from non-professional working class authors. Prenderleith's article, as I said, carried what I think is something of a shocking comment. He claimed, when discussing dormant websites, reading old articles there doesn't quite invoke the same atavistic pleasure as browsing a pile of faded old magazines. He says websites should maybe be updated or deleted. That's always been the nature of the internet. Indeed, scores of sites are now dead addresses, and maybe it's better that way. Now, I may be unusual in that I do like returning to reread old blog posts and that kind of thing, and I'm not sure the reasons for this are purely atavistic, but all the same, this apparent enthusiasm for the non-conservation, in effect the deletion or destruction even, amateur writing still leaves me feeling very worried. In addition to the focus on correspondence I mentioned just now, there have been several recent research projects on what we might term non-professional journalism from the Victorian period and 20th century, and Teal Triggs of the Royal College of Arts demonstrates in her work the importance of music fanzines from the 1970s and 80s on graphic design. 1980s football fanzine culture no doubt provides a similarly rich source of access to non-professional voices at what was a politically charged period, the period of stadium disasters like Heysel and Hillsborough, when it was easy for politicians to label all football fans as a hooligan threat, and thus a scapegoat for systematic failures on the part of the authorities. Had the amateur writers from this period been blogging instead of producing print content, then following Prenderleith's logic we would have very little access to their voices. This would surely not be a cause for celebration, or indeed even acceptance. This presentation is not primarily concerned with sports journalism, but I'm using this as an example of what the recent history of periodical studies and my own experience in producing both my chapter for this book and also the book itself might tell us about the preservation of voices and the importance of inclusivity in how we think about periodicals. All of the contributors to this book demonstrate the importance of preservation. Their essays wouldn't be there without it, after all. To expand a little on this, Gregory Tate in his chapter was lucky or perhaps prescient in his choice, in that advertising wrappers, key to his investigations of the circulation of scientific terminology in Punch, had been preserved in the print editions held by the British Library. Had he been working on most other periodicals which have been preserved in volume form, aside from newspapers, most of these advertisements would not be available, owing to decisions made many years ago about importance, in the days when a PhD focusing on a periodical such as Reynolds's Miscellany would have seemed bizarre. Tate's chapter shows us that in fact adverts played an essential part in the dissemination and understanding of scientific jargon in the 19th century. What was marginal is central to contemporary scholarship on that periodical. Periodical studies too has revolutionised what we consider central to Victorian literature. Authors like Mary Elizabeth Braddon and Margaret Oliphant would remain in the peripheries of literary studies were it not for the interventions of scholars who focus on periodicals, many of whom are present at this conference today, and again I'm sorry I can't be there. We might add Arnold Bennett to this list of previously marginal figures, albeit he's a writer whose first novel was published in 1898 and as such isn't really a Victorian for most of his career. As Peter D. MacDonald's work shows, Bennett had an extensive knowledge of the literary marketplace via his writing for periodicals as diverse as Titbits and The Yellow Book, and also editing Woman, among other periodicals. Bennett saw what he called his writing for money as entirely separate from his literary writing, and it is in the latter category that we can place the short story of 1907, The Death of Simon Fuge, from The Grim Smile of the Five Towns. Some of you might know this story. It's narrated by a pretentious, rich Londoner, who, on hearing of the death of an artist who is native to the North Midlands, the world of the Five Towns, as Bennett calls them, travels there and experiences a 24-hour immersion in the culture of this non-London world. It seems to be won over, changing, among other things, his preferred form of cigarettes. At the end, he's still deeply shocked by the lack of reference to the supposedly significant artistic death on the boards advertising the local paper. Instead, what he sees is this: Hanbridge Rates lively meeting, Knipe FC new centre forward, all winners an SP. Knipe is the name in Bennett's work for Stoke-on-Trent. He raises this lack of reference with his Knipe-dwelling counterpart, who we are told grows slightly impatient, and notes, "Last season, Knipe Football Club jolly nearly got thrown out of the First League. The constitution of the team for this next season, why, damn it, it's a question of national importance. You don't understand these things. If Knipe Football Club was put into the League Second Division, 10,000 homes would go into mourning. Who the devil was Simon Fuge?" Bennett's point is not that art is unimportant, nor is it that Londoners and men from the North cannot understand each other, nor is it that men from the North would instinctively prefer football to art. Instead, it's that the issue of importance is always subjective. Criticism over the last 100 years or so has corrected this fictional imbalance of coverage. Compare, for instance, how many references there are to Yellow Book in the Victorian Periodicals Review Archive, 47, versus the word football, 7. Magazines such as the All England Cricket and Football Journal and Athletic Review were nonetheless foundational in the establishment of local and national celebrity via their portraits of sportsmen, and there is still much work to be done on them, if, that is, they've been preserved. Compare too how much attention is paid to a writer like Eliza Cook with a writer like Alfred Austin, conservative editor, journalist and poet, and the subject of my chapter in Case Studies. Part of the joy in periodicals research, and literary research more generally, as well as the importance of that research, is thinking about marginality and trying to make the apparently invisible visible. That we should always pay attention to what is being left out, as well as what is being focused on. This makes it all the more important that we pay attention to inclusivity in our approach to preservation. To change a phrase slightly that we hear quite a lot, this year's deleted websites are the advertising wrappers of the future. At this point, I'd like to thank the judges of the prize. I'm really overwhelmed to have won, as well as my fellow editors who are there in person, and our fantastic contributors and advisory team, as well as all those who helped the book get published. I'm very sorry to not be with you there in person. I'll catch up with us all, not least on Twitter, in due course, and if you want to get in touch with me, this is my email address and Twitter handle. Thank you very much.